What is up, guys? We all know them as the untouchable global kings of music, but what really happens when the bright spotlight gets way too hot and that perfect idol image starts to crack? From shocking boardroom whispers to wild, unpredictable late-night chaos, this year has been an absolute roller coaster for the world's biggest boy band. Who is actually pulling the strings behind closed doors? Were these explosive scandals meticulously planned by a hidden mastermind, or did reality just spin wildly out of control? Are you genuinely ready to uncover the raw, unfiltered truth hiding behind those pristine, camera-ready smiles? Grab your snacks, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't blink, because we are diving headfirst into our ultimate countdown. Who is behind all this? 7 most unbelievable BTS controversies of the year. Number 7. Jungkook. The Midnight Rebellion. Unfiltered Magne. System crash. We start our unbelievable journey into the shadows of the world's biggest phenomenon with a moment that seemingly shattered the impenetrable walls of the K-pop industry. A highly controversial event that forced millions to question the very nature of idol culture. Enter Jungkook, the undisputed golden magne, the untouchable pride of HYB, a global superstar who suddenly decided that the meticulously written corporate script was finally meant to be burned to ashes in the dead of the night. Picture this. It is 3 a.m. in Seoul. The PR managers, the stylists, the bodyguards, and the entire multi-million-dollar machinery that surrounds BTS are deep in their slumber, resting before another grueling day of scheduled perfection. But then, millions of smartphones across the globe simultaneously light up, buzzing with a single, unannounced notification that sends immediate, paralyzing shockwaves through the corporate offices and boardrooms. Jungkook is live. He is completely alone, entirely unsupervised, and spectacularly unbothered by the ironclad, unspoken rules of idol broadcasting that dictate every single move an artist makes. This isn't your standard, heavily moderated, brightly lit V-Live session with carefully vetted questions, scripted answers, flawless makeup, and polite, rehearsed bows. No, this is a raw, unfiltered, and deeply human rebellion happening in real time, broadcast directly into the bedrooms of millions of fans worldwide. For years, the industry has thrived and generated billions of dollars on a carefully constructed illusion of absolute perfection, meticulously controlling every spoken word, every casual outfit, every fleeting facial expression, and every public interaction to maintain the ultimate fantasy of the flawless idol. But here is Jungkook, arguably the most influential pop star on the entire planet right now, sitting comfortably in his own living room, casually folding his underwear, doing his late-night laundry, pouring himself a drink, and singing impromptu karaoke until the early hours of the morning, completely and utterly shattering the fourth wall that separates the godlike celebrity from the mere mortal. Why did this seemingly innocent, mundane late-night activity suddenly mutate into one of the most fiercely debated and unbelievable controversies of the entire year? Because in a rigid, traditional industry built on absolute, uncompromising control, unpredictability is considered the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Behind the closed doors of the agency, industry insiders and whistleblowers reported a scene of sheer, unadulterated panic. Imagine the frantic, sweat-inducing phone calls between executives in the middle of the night, the panicked community managers scrambling to figure out if they should forcibly cut the live feed, the terrifying realization that pulling the plug on a broadcast currently being watched by over 10 million fiercely loyal armies would instantly trigger a PR nightmare of catastrophic proportions. Was this a highly calculated, incredibly risky move engineered by a hidden genius within the company's marketing department to humanize their increasingly untouchable star, or was this a genuine, exhausted, desperate cry for normalcy from a young man, who has spent his entire formative years suffocating under a relentless, unforgiving microscope? The massive controversy wasn't simply about what he was actually doing on camera. It was fundamentally about the sheer, breathtaking defiance of the act itself. Conservative media outlets, malicious online trolls, and highly critical netizens immediately seized the narrative with vicious intent, openly questioning his professionalism, brutally debating whether his late-night drinking, his unstyled hair, and his rare emotional vulnerability were entirely inappropriate and damaging for a global ambassador of South Korean culture. They desperately tried to paint this profoundly human moment as a dangerous downward spiral, a severe loss of discipline, a sign that the golden boy was finally cracking under the immense pressure. But let's pause, take a deep breath, and look at the actual facts and the profound emotional undercurrent hiding just beneath the surface of this manufactured scandal. We are talking about a young artist who has literally carried the immense weight of the world and his country's economy on his shoulders, a boy who debuted at the incredibly tender age of 15, willingly sacrificing his youth, his anonymity, his privacy, and his personal freedom for the sake of his beloved team and his devoted fans. By going live at the witching hour, eventually succumbing to exhaustion, falling completely asleep in front of the camera, and letting millions of people hear his soft, rhythmic snores for nearly an hour, he wasn't just resting his tired eyes. He was making a radical, unprecedented statement of absolute trust and overwhelming exhaustion. The toxic narrative aggressively pushed by relentless haters and click-hungry media was that the powerhouse agency had completely lost control of their biggest asset, that the flawless system was permanently breaking down, and that the idol was rapidly spiraling into dark, unpredictable territory. But if you strip away the sensationalist headlines and the clickbait thumbnails, the reality is deeply reflective and incredibly moving. It forcefully makes us ask the hard, uncomfortable questions. What is the true, hidden cost of manufactured perfection? How much of an idol's soul is legally owned by the faceless corporation? And how much truly belongs to the individual human being breathing behind the microphone? These unauthorized midnight broadcasts quickly snowballed into a massive cultural phenomenon, systematically breaking every single viewership record in history, crashing servers globally, and unequivocally proving that the modern public violently craves raw authenticity far more than they want polished, plastic, manufactured pop perfection. Yet, despite the massive outpouring of love from the fans, the dark boardroom whispers and malicious industry rumors continued to swirl with terrifying intensity. Allegations surfaced that emergency, high-stakes meetings were secretly held at the highest levels of management, that draconian new contract clauses were being aggressively debated to permanently restrict social media access, and that the escalating tension between the artist's desperate desire for genuine, unfiltered human connection and the billion-dollar company's desperate need for absolute brand safety had finally reached an explosive boiling point. The sheer, unadulterated defiance of simply existing and living normally while being watched by the entire world turned an ordinary, quiet night into a massive, global battleground for personal agency and individual identity. Think about the timing, folks. With the looming, inevitable shadow of massive transitions and military enlistments hanging heavy over the entire group, every single public appearance is heavily scrutinized, dissected, and monetized by the media and the stock market. Number 6. Suga, the electric scooter witch hunt, a nation divided. We now move to a controversy that completely ripped the mask off the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the South Korean media landscape, exposing a deeply sinister and bloodthirsty culture of public shaming that left the entire globe absolutely speechless. Enter Min Yoongi, globally revered as Suga, the razor-sharp rapper, the genius producer, and the fierce, unapologetic alter ego known as August D. A man who has built his entire legendary career on brutally confronting societal hypocrisy, advocating for mental health, and speaking raw, unfiltered truth to power. But what happens when the very system he routinely critiques decides it is finally time to publicly execute him? Fast forward to a seemingly quiet, unremarkable night in August, during a highly sensitive period where Jung was quietly and diligently serving his mandatory military duty as a public service worker, completely out of the dazzling global spotlight. The story begins with a profoundly human, deeply regrettable, yet ultimately victimless mistake. After a private dinner and a few drinks, Jung decided to ride a small, foldable electric scooter the very short distance back to his home. Just as he was turning into the main gate of his own residence, navigating a tight corner on an empty, quiet sidewalk, he lost his balance and harmlessly tipped over. A passing police patrol immediately assisted him. A standard breathalyzer test was administered on the spot. He fully and honestly cooperated with the authorities. His license was revoked, and he paid the legal fine. In any normal, rational universe, for any ordinary, everyday citizen, this is a standard, albeit serious, traffic violation that ends quietly with a legal penalty, a harsh personal lesson learned, and absolutely zero front-page headlines. But Min Jung-hee is definitely not an ordinary citizen. He is a core, irreplaceable pillar of the absolute biggest musical act on the entire planet, and the ruthless, profit-driven clickbait media machine immediately saw an unprecedented, golden opportunity to draw high-profile blood. Within mere hours, the factual narrative was maliciously and violently twisted, aggressively hijacked by faceless online trolls, and massively amplified by major broadcast networks who were entirely desperate for sky-high ratings. The situation completely exploded into a catastrophic, full-blown national crisis when a major, highly respected South Korean television network deliberately broadcasted completely fake, unverified, and highly damaging CCTV footage to millions of viewers. This falsified, entirely inaccurate video showed an unidentified individual recklessly speeding down a busy, multi-lane road on a motorized scooter, falsely and brazenly claiming that the dangerous, out-of-control figure in the video was actually Suga. The public outrage that followed was instantaneous, entirely manufactured, and incredibly toxic. Millions of netizens, heavily fueled by the terrifying combination of deliberate misinformation and a deep-seated, systemic jealousy of the group's unimaginable global success, aggressively demanded his immediate, permanent removal from BTS. The sheer, terrifying scale of the coordinated attack was absolutely staggering. Mysterious, heavily funded anti-fan groups mobilized overnight, physically sending hundreds of ominous, funeral-style protest wreaths and aggressively blaring protest trucks to perfectly block the main entrance of the massive HYB headquarters. It was a calculated, merciless psychological siege meticulously designed to break the artist's spirit and forcefully twist the massive company's hand. Behind the heavily guarded doors of the corporate boardroom, the sheer panic must have been completely suffocating and absolutely paralyzing. Executive crisis meetings were undoubtedly running nonstop. Panicked PR teams were frantically drowning in a massive tsunami of malicious hate articles, and the company's multi-billion-dollar stock valuation violently trembled under the immense, crushing pressure of this unprecedented media witch hunt. Who was actually funding these massive, highly expensive truck protests that seemingly appeared out of thin air? Was this a highly coordinated, strategic attack orchestrated by bitter, rival entertainment factions desperately trying to permanently cripple the undisputed kings of K-pop while they were separated and highly vulnerable during their mandatory military service? Or was it simply the terrifying, uncontrollable, and highly toxic manifestation of modern cancel culture rapidly mutating into a monstrous, unstoppable beast? But then, the absolute unthinkable happened, forever altering the course of this manufactured scandal. the actual truth finally fought its way to the surface. Genuine, strictly verified CCTV footage from the actual night in question was finally released by an independent media outlet, and it completely, unequivocally destroyed the mainstream media's carefully constructed narrative of a reckless, dangerous criminal menace. The real, unedited video clearly showed Yoongi moving incredibly slowly, carefully wearing his safety helmet, quietly navigating the entirely empty pedestrian path, and simply falling over at a near standstill right at his own front door. The shocking revelation was a massive, intensely humiliating bombshell for the entire mainstream media establishment. The major broadcasting network that confidently aired the fake footage was forcefully backed into a corner and forced to issue a deeply embarrassing, highly publicized national apology, entirely exposing their shocking lack of basic journalistic integrity and their desperate, pathetic hunger for sensationalized clickbait at the extreme expense of a human being's life, career, and mental health. Yet, despite the truth being laid completely bare for the entire world to see, the relentless, bloodthirsty machinery of public humiliation still aggressively demanded its pound of flesh. Yoongi was brutally subjected to the deeply controversial and highly criticized South Korean practice of the photo line, a harsh, unforgiving modern-day public pillory where public figures are deliberately forced to stand in front of hundreds of aggressively flashing cameras and ruthlessly shouting reporters to be publicly shamed and humiliated before officially entering the police station. Watching this incredibly proud, immensely talented artist, who has physically brought billions of dollars to his country's economy and single-handedly elevated its global cultural status to completely unprecedented heights, forcefully subjected to such intense, disproportionate, and entirely unnecessary degradation for a victimless misdemeanor was deeply heartbreaking and incredibly infuriating for millions of fiercely loyal fans worldwide. This agonizing, drawn-out controversy wasn't simply about a man falling off a scooter. It was a profound, terrifying reflection of a hypercritical, intensely pressured society that actively preys on its own brightest stars, eagerly waiting with bated breath for the exact moment they inevitably stumble so they can violently tear them apart for public entertainment. Number 5. RM. The corporate civil war, a leader's silent burden, betrayal from within. We are diving even deeper into the murky, terrifyingly dark waters of corporate greed and unimaginable betrayal, stepping away from the bustling streets and straight into the cold, sterile, multi-million-dollar boardrooms where human lives are treated like entirely disposable poker chips. Enter Kim Namjoon, globally recognized as RM, the brilliant mastermind, the unyielding pillar of strength, and the legendary leader of BTS, a man who has spent over a decade meticulously crafting the group's profound, heavily philosophical message while simultaneously bearing the crushing, suffocating weight of protecting his 6 brothers from the ruthless, soul-crushing machinery of the entertainment industry. But what happens when the most lethal, devastating attack doesn't come from malicious online trolls or bitter rival fandoms, but violently erupts from the very inside of the billion-dollar house that he himself built from the ground up? Let us rewind to the absolute most chaotic, earth-shattering corporate scandal to ever rock the South Korean entertainment industry, the catastrophic, highly publicized internal civil war within HYB. While RM and the rest of the members were quietly, honorably fulfilling their mandatory military service, physically stripped of their global platforms and entirely unable to publicly defend themselves, a massive, explosive power struggle violently erupted between the top-tier executives of their parent company and a highly influential, fiercely ambitious subsidiary CEO. Overnight, the absolute biggest, most profitable entertainment conglomerate on the entire planet transformed into a toxic, highly radioactive battlefield of leaked documents, secret audits, emergency press conferences, and vicious, cutthroat smear campaigns. And right in the incredibly dangerous crossfire of this unprecedented corporate bloodbath was the sacred, untouchable legacy of BTS. As the terrifyingly messy legal war played out in real time across national television and every single major news outlet, highly classified, deeply sensitive internal company documents were suddenly, maliciously leaked to the completely voracious public. These shocking, heavily redacted files exposed a deeply sinister, highly calculated corporate strategy that left millions of fans absolutely paralyzed with disgust and absolute horror. The leaks seemingly revealed that highly paid, faceless executives were callously debating using BTS's legendary, hard-earned global achievements as mere bargaining chips, manipulating media narratives, and allegedly even orchestrating quiet, undercover smear campaigns against their own artists just to strategically gain the upper hand in a ruthless, ego-driven boardroom brawl. The level of intricate, multi-layered deception involved in this massive, highly publicized scandal absolutely boggles the mind. Imagine the terrifying, highly stressful reality of knowing that the people eagerly smiling at you during highly televised press conferences are simultaneously actively drafting highly classified, heavily guarded contingency plans to systematically minimize your massive global influence, just in case you ever decide to legally flex your immense power. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated psychological torture for RM, a leader who has literally bled, sweat, and cried for over a decade to painstakingly build a legacy based on genuine sincerity, self-love, and profound artistic integrity, only to be forced to helplessly watch from the incredibly isolating confines of a military barracks as greedy, power-hungry businessmen ruthlessly dragged his life's work through the absolute mud. He was entirely silenced by strict military protocol, fundamentally unable to hold a microphone, unable to release a comforting statement to his fiercely loyal fans, and unable to shield his beloved team from the highly toxic, radioactive fallout of a war they had absolutely nothing to do with. The mainstream media violently feasted on the unprecedented chaos, aggressively publishing thousands of speculative, highly damaging articles every single day, aggressively questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the company's past successes and attempting to permanently tarnish the pristine, globally respected brand that RM had sacrificed his entire youth to carefully protect. This wasn't just a simple, easily dismissed rumor. This was a terrifying, deeply existential threat to the very core identity of BTS, heavily orchestrated by the very people who were legally and morally obligated to protect them at all costs. The unbearable silence from the military base was incredibly deafening, completely filled with an overwhelming, palpable anxiety that swept across the entire global fandom. Who was actually protecting the boys when the heavily fortified castle walls were violently crumbling from the inside out? Was this massive, incredibly destructive feud deliberately orchestrated by a hidden, deeply envious third party entirely desperate to see the absolute downfall of the K-pop monopoly? Or was it simply the inevitable, highly toxic consequence of a massive corporate empire rapidly expanding way too fast, ultimately collapsing under the immense, crushing weight of its own unchecked, insatiable greed? As the vicious, highly publicized legal battles raged on, with executives aggressively pointing fingers and shedding crocodile tears in front of thousands of aggressively flashing cameras, RM did something incredibly profound, subtly genius, and entirely characteristic of a true, deeply philosophical artist. Through the highly anticipated, pre-planned release of his deeply personal, intensely introspective solo works and incredibly curated social media updates, he aggressively, yet beautifully, shattered the deafening silence without ever actually breaking a single military rule. The raw, incredibly experimental, and deeply melancholic themes of feeling entirely alienated, utterly displaced, and completely disconnected from the massive, suffocating machinery of fame perfectly mirrored the terrifying, chaotic reality unfolding outside the heavily guarded military base. He didn't need to post a frantic, angry rant. He simply let his undeniable, world-class artistry and brilliant mind speak the absolute, unfiltered truth. It was a stunning, breathtaking masterclass in quiet, unyielding defiance, a highly sophisticated reminder to the power-hungry executives in their sleek, glass-walled offices that while they might legally own the massive, highly lucrative distribution rights, they will never, ever own the beating, highly creative soul of the artist. The controversy aggressively forces us all to take a very long, incredibly hard look at the harsh, deeply unsettling realities of the modern music industry. It brutally exposes the incredibly fragile, highly volatile illusion of the perfectly harmonious corporate family that these massive agencies so desperately try to sell to the deeply emotionally invested public. It forces every single one of us to aggressively question the true, hidden cost of absolute global domination. When a single artist becomes completely responsible for a massive, multi-billion-dollar percentage of an entire nation's gross domestic product, do they eventually cease to be treated as human beings and instead become heavily guarded, highly contested corporate assets to be ruthlessly fought over by greedy shareholders? The sheer, overwhelming audacity of these highly paid executives to actively jeopardize the mental health, the pristine reputation, and the enduring, historical legacy of the very artists who physically bought them their luxury cars and funded their extravagant, high-rise office buildings is absolutely staggering and deeply infuriating. Number 4. V. The Paris Illusion, a stolen romance, the death of privacy. We are now stepping away from the sterile, fluorescent-lit boardrooms of corporate greed and plunging straight into the impossibly glamorous, yet incredibly dangerous, high-fashion streets of Europe to uncover a controversy that permanently blurred the terrifying line between public figure and heavily hunted prey. Enter Kim Taehyung, globally adored as V, the ultimate visual, the baritone-voiced soul singer, and the undisputed global fashion icon, whose very existence effortlessly dictates worldwide trends and sells out luxury brands in mere seconds. But beneath the dazzling, multi-million-dollar ambassadorships and the breathtaking magazine covers lies a deeply disturbing, highly toxic reality that forcefully begs the question: does absolute fame completely eradicate a human being's fundamental right to simply exist? The explosive controversy began with what should have been the most ordinary, beautifully mundane human experience imaginable: a quiet, late-night stroll down a picturesque, moonlit street in Paris. For any normal young person in their 20s, holding hands with someone you care about while enjoying the cool evening breeze is a deeply personal, entirely unremarkable core memory. But for V, this incredibly fleeting, beautifully human moment was violently hijacked, aggressively commodified, and instantly transformed into one of the most explosive, highly destructive global scandals of the entire year. Suddenly, out of the deep shadows, a grainy, highly zoomed-in, secretly recorded video surfaced on the darkest, most toxic corners of the internet, instantly igniting a massive, uncontrollable digital wildfire that consumed every single social media platform on the entire planet. The sheer, unprecedented magnitude of the global reaction was absolutely paralyzing. Millions of deeply invested fans, click-hungry media outlets, and highly malicious online trolls instantly mobilized, violently dissecting every single pixel of the blurry footage, aggressively analyzing his gait, his casual clothing, and even the panicked body language of his accompanying management team. This wasn't just a simple, harmless celebrity sighting. It was a highly coordinated, heavily monetized invasion of profound human privacy that forcefully stripped away his dignity and violently threw his personal life into a merciless, bloodthirsty global coliseum. The deeply sinister underbelly of this massive controversy lies not in the alleged romance itself, but in the terrifying, highly lucrative, and entirely illegal global network of saying fans and professional stalker paparazzi who literally hunt these artists like highly prized, exotic animals. Who actually recorded this massive, world-breaking footage? Was it just a lucky, passing tourist? Or was it a deeply unhinged, highly organized syndicate that had been meticulously tracking his completely private, highly classified flight schedules, bribing hotel staff, and aggressively trailing his every single movement through the winding streets of a foreign country? The terrifying reality is that a massive, multi-million-dollar underground economy thrives entirely on stealing, trading, and weaponizing the deeply private moments of global superstars. The vicious, highly toxic backlash that immediately followed the release of this stolen footage was absolutely unprecedented in its sheer, unadulterated cruelty. Instead of fiercely condemning the blatant, illegal invasion of his basic human rights, a massive, highly vocal fraction of the internet aggressively turned their weapons entirely on him, viciously accusing him of betraying the highly unrealistic, deeply parasocial fantasy that the K-pop industry so heavily relies upon. He was brutally dragged through the absolute mud, subjected to thousands of highly coordinated, deeply malicious smear campaigns, and intensely cyberbullied simply for daring to engage in a completely normal, deeply human connection. The unbearable, suffocating hypocrisy of the global entertainment machine was violently laid bare for the entire world to witness. The industry forcefully demands that these young, incredibly vulnerable artists continuously project the ultimate, highly romanticized boyfriend or girlfriend image to aggressively sell millions of albums and heavily monetize the absolute devotion of their fans. But the absolute second they actually dare to experience genuine love or seek basic human companionship in their own private lives, they are instantly, ruthlessly crucified and publicly labeled as massive, unforgivable traitors. As the massive, highly destructive media circus raged on for weeks, completely dominating global headlines and heavily manipulating stock market prices, the deafening, calculated silence from the massive, heavily fortified corporate headquarters was incredibly chilling. Instead of launching a massive, highly aggressive legal strike to permanently destroy the stalkers and fiercely protect their artist from the intense, suffocating psychological warfare, the agency issued a deeply vague, incredibly frustrating, legally safe statement coldly claiming that they cannot confirm matters regarding the artist's private life. This highly calculated, deeply sterile corporate response effectively threw him directly into the massive, highly dangerous shark tank, forcing him to silently endure the absolute brunt of the intense global hysteria completely alone, without a single shield or public defense from the multi-billion-dollar empire he had sacrificed his entire youth to carefully build. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable psychological terror of knowing that literally nowhere on the entire planet is safe, that every single window, every dark alleyway, and every casual interaction is a potential weapon highly primed to permanently destroy your career and shatter your profound mental peace. Imagine the deep, agonizing heartbreak of realizing that your own genuine, human emotions are nothing more than highly contested, easily exploited clickbait for a deeply cynical, heavily corrupted media landscape. This explosive, unprecedented controversy was never, ever about a simple dating rumor. It was a profound, terrifying, and deeply sobering reflection of a hyper-connected, heavily voyeuristic modern society that violently demands absolute, 24/7 access to the very souls of its biggest cultural icons, completely forgetting that there is a real, beating, incredibly fragile human heart behind the massive, multi-million-dollar brand. V, heavily known for his deep, profound emotional intelligence and fiercely protective love for his genuine fans, was forcefully pushed to the absolute psychological brink, his fundamental right to basic, ordinary human happiness viciously stolen by a faceless, highly coordinated army of digital predators. The global army, deeply shattered by the terrifying violation of his privacy, launched massive, highly organized global campaigns aggressively demanding the total eradication of Saesian culture and forcefully pleading for sweeping, highly protective legal reforms to fiercely guard the fundamental human rights of global entertainers. Number 3. Jimin. The seized sanctuary, corporate incompetence, a star betrayed. We are now plunging directly into a deeply infuriating, mind-boggling scandal that entirely exposes the sheer, unadulterated incompetence of the very corporate machinery sworn to protect these global icons, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on a massive failure that left the entire world absolutely speechless. Enter Park Jimin, the fiercely beloved, ethereal lead vocalist and main dancer of BTS, an artist whose mesmerizing, gravity-defying stage presence and deeply compassionate, incredibly gentle heart have single-handedly comforted millions across the globe. But what exactly happens when the massive, multi-billion-dollar agency entrusted with meticulously managing every single-minute detail of his highly complex, intensely globe-trotting life spectacularly fails at the most basic, fundamental administrative task imaginable, deliberately throwing his pristine, globally respected reputation straight into the merciless, bloodthirsty jaws of the hypercritical South Korean media? Fast forward to a seemingly ordinary, quiet morning that violently erupted into a massive, unprecedented national scandal when highly sensitive, strictly confidential government documents were suddenly, maliciously leaked to the deeply voracious public, revealing that Jimin's ultra-luxurious, multi-million-dollar private residence at the highly exclusive 9-1 Hanam had been officially, legally seized by the National Health Insurance Service due to allegedly unpaid health insurance premiums. The massive, highly destructive shockwave was instantaneous, absolutely deafening, and completely paralyzing. How on earth does one of the absolute wealthiest, most phenomenally successful pop stars on the entire planet, a young man who literally generates hundreds of millions of dollars for the national economy every single year and proudly represents his country at the United Nations, suddenly become a highly publicized target for property seizure over a relatively minuscule, easily affordable administrative fee? The relentless, click-hungry mainstream media and vicious, highly coordinated anti-fan syndicates immediately pounced on this shocking revelation with terrifying speed and deep, malicious intent, aggressively painting this deeply responsible, incredibly hardworking artist as a careless, completely irresponsible tax evader, ruthlessly dragging his carefully built, flawlessly maintained name through the absolute mud in a massive, highly synchronized digital witch hunt. But as the terrifying, suffocating dust of public outrage slowly began to settle, the absolute, undeniable truth slowly crawled out from the dark, corporate shadows, and it was infinitely more infuriating and deeply heartbreaking than the vicious, heavily fabricated lies. During the exact period these routine, highly important insurance notices were being physically mailed to his residence, Jimin was physically entirely out of the country, embarking on a massive, highly grueling overseas schedule, heavily relying entirely on his multi-billion-dollar management company to responsibly handle his personal mail, his crucial financial notifications, and his deeply sensitive administrative duties as a standard, ironclad practice for heavily protected, hyper-managed global superstars. The shocking, Terrifying reality was that the massive, highly funded agency completely, spectacularly dropped the ball, carelessly misplacing these highly important legal notices, fundamentally failing to inform their biggest artist of the pending payments, and blindly allowing the strict legal deadlines to tragically expire while he was heavily focused on delivering world-class performances on the global stage. When the explosive, highly damaging news finally broke and the public backlash violently peaked, instead of immediately, fiercely throwing themselves in front of the massive media firing squad to aggressively protect the artist who literally built their massive, glittering empire from the ground up, the company issued a deeply frustrating, highly passive, legally sanitized statement weekly citing company negligence and administrative oversight. But the immense, deeply unfair, and irreparable damage had already been brutally inflicted upon the artist's soul. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable psychological distress of being a world-class, heavily scrutinized public figure, completely dedicated to your grueling, exhaustion-inducing craft, only to wake up thousands of miles from home to thousands of highly toxic, deeply malicious headlines ruthlessly attacking your fundamental moral character simply because the highly paid executives and administrative staff sitting comfortably in their massive, air-conditioned corporate headquarters failed to properly open a standard piece of mail. Think about the terrifying, highly disproportionate power dynamics at play here. When an ordinary citizen misses a payment, they receive a quiet warning. When a global phenomenon misses a payment due to their management's blatant incompetence, it instantly becomes international breaking news, heavily broadcasted across multiple continents, and viciously utilized as a highly toxic weapon to aggressively dismantle their mental health and permanently stain their legacy. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the modern clickbait media ecosystem was violently exposed, as countless journalists knowingly chose to ignore the highly plausible reality of an administrative error, instead opting to eagerly fan the massive, highly destructive flames of public outrage just to secure a few extra clicks, heavily monetize the controversy, and secure a temporary boost in their daily ad revenue. It deeply, aggressively forces every single one of us to heavily question the intense, almost pathological obsession society has with eagerly watching its brightest, most beautiful stars violently fall from grace. Why do we heavily demand absolute, uncompromising, godlike perfection from these young, incredibly vulnerable artists, yet eagerly wait with bated breath to completely tear them to absolute shreds the second a minor, deeply human or administrative error inevitably occurs? And what was the absolute, most heartbreaking, deeply anger-inducing climax of this entirely manufactured, corporate-driven disaster? Jimin, the deeply empathetic, incredibly humble artist, physically took it upon himself to personally, deeply apologize to his fiercely loyal fans on a public platform for causing them unnecessary worry, completely taking the massive, highly public hit and bearing the immense shame for a blatant, undeniable corporate failure that was entirely, unequivocally out of his personal control. His profound, heart-wrenching resilience in the face of this intensely frustrating, heavily fabricated scandal is a massive, highly inspiring testament to his deep, unwavering character, but it also paints a deeply tragic, incredibly sorrowful picture of the immense, suffocating isolation that comes with standing at the absolute, untouchable zenith of global fame. He stood there, entirely alone in the massive, highly volatile court of public opinion, heavily bearing the immense, crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar company's blatant, highly embarrassing mistakes, quietly absorbing the intense, highly toxic vitriol with the deep, profound grace of a true, tested professional. Number 2. Jeon. The unwanted embrace, a pure intention weaponized, the ultimate betrayal of trust. We are now approaching the absolute bleeding edge of this terrifying countdown, shifting our intense focus from the cold, calculating corporate boardrooms directly into the highly volatile, wildly unpredictable, and deeply unsettling territory of fan entitlement and the violent shattering of deeply established boundaries. Enter Kim Seokjin, universally adored as Jeon, the striking visual, the powerhouse vocalist, and the deeply responsible eldest brother of BTS, a man who has consistently been the grounding emotional anchor for both his 6 younger members and millions of devoted fans worldwide. After completing 18 grueling, physically exhausting months of mandatory military service as an elite assistant drill instructor, completely stripped of his glittering celebrity status and enduring the harsh, unforgiving elements alongside ordinary citizens, his highly anticipated discharge in June of 2024 was universally celebrated as a massive, joyous global holiday. The sheer, overwhelming wave of emotion and relief that swept across the entire planet was absolutely palpable, and Jeon, possessing a heart overflowing with profound, unmatched gratitude for the fans who patiently waited for his safe return, decided to orchestrate an incredibly beautiful, highly unprecedented gesture of pure love. Against the strict, heavily cautious advice of his massive corporate security team, he bravely insisted on hosting an incredibly intimate, massive in-person event where he would physically hug 1,000 randomly selected fans to personally thank them for their unyielding loyalty. It was supposed to be a deeply moving, beautifully healing milestone, a warm, physical reconnection between an artist and his devoted supporters after a painfully long separation. But within mere hours, this pure, unadulterated act of genuine kindness was violently hijacked, entirely weaponized, and brutally transformed into one of the most horrifying, deeply traumatizing, and intensely debated controversies of the entire year. As the heavily emotional event unfolded, with hundreds of fans respectfully and tearfully sharing brief, polite embraces with the visibly exhausted but radiantly happy idol, a deeply sinister, completely horrifying disruption suddenly shattered the beautiful atmosphere. A small handful of deeply unhinged, intensely entitled individuals entirely crossed the sacred line of basic human decency, aggressively grabbing his neck and violently attempting to forcefully kiss him on the cheek and lips against his clear, visible resistance. The terrifying, highly disturbing footage of these aggressive, non-consensual encounters was instantly captured from multiple angles by the surrounding crowd and immediately flooded every single social media platform on the internet, igniting a massive, unprecedented explosion of visceral rage, utter disgust, and profound heartbreak that completely paralyzed the global community. The sheer unadulterated audacity of violating a human being's fundamental bodily autonomy under the false, sickening guise of fan love was absolutely staggering and deeply, intensely infuriating. This was not a minor, easily forgiven lapse in judgment. This was a blatant, heavily documented act of sexual harassment broadcasted to the entire world, physically perpetrated against a man who had literally just returned from serving his country and simply wanted to offer a warm, comforting embrace. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable psychological shock and deep, agonizing betrayal Jeon must have felt in that exact, terrifying split second. He had willingly stepped out from behind the massive, multi-million-dollar bulletproof glass of corporate protection, entirely lowering his defensive walls to offer his genuine, beating heart to the people he trusted most, only to be aggressively ambushed and physically violated in return. The intense, highly toxic reality of the extreme parasocial relationship was violently exposed for the entire world to witness, brutally proving that when millions of people are relentlessly sold the highly romanticized illusion of absolute accessibility to a global superstar, a terrifying, highly dangerous fraction of them will inevitably blur the line between deep admiration and aggressive, predatory ownership. The immediate, highly explosive fallout from this catastrophic event was absolutely deafening, instantly dominating national news broadcasts and triggering massive, highly intense cultural debates regarding the deeply inadequate legal protections afforded to male victims of sexual harassment in the notoriously strict South Korean entertainment industry. The fiercely protective global army did not merely express their outrage. They aggressively, relentlessly mobilized like a highly trained military unit, immediately tracking down the identities of the perpetrators and formally filing massive, highly coordinated police reports aggressively demanding strict criminal investigations and severe, uncompromising legal consequences for the horrifying assault. But the deeply unsettling, massively heartbreaking question forcefully remains. How does an artist ever truly recover from such a profound, deeply intimate violation of trust? When the very act of extending an open hand is aggressively met with an unwanted, violent attack on your personal boundaries, how do you ever find the immense courage to freely interact with the public again? The massive corporate machinery, deeply embarrassed and heavily criticized for their blatant failure to physically protect their most precious asset during a heavily planned, officially sanctioned event, frantically scrambled to issue highly sterile, legally cautious statements promising enhanced security measures. But the profound, deeply emotional damage had already been brutally inflicted. This deeply terrifying controversy fundamentally shattered the beautiful, delicate illusion of the safe space between idol and fan, forcefully replacing it with a cold, deeply cynical reality where every single interaction must now be heavily monitored, strictly policed, and heavily shielded by aggressive, highly intimidating bodyguards. It aggressively forces every single one of us to take a long, incredibly uncomfortable look deep into the mirror and intensely question the highly toxic, deeply consuming nature of modern celebrity worship. Who is fundamentally to blame when a beautifully pure, incredibly generous human intention is violently corrupted by the dark, uncontrollable obsession of a few deeply disturbed individuals? Was this massive, highly destructive incident an unavoidable, tragic consequence of a billion-dollar industry that heavily profits off manufacturing intense, unhealthy emotional dependencies, or simply the terrifying, unpredictable nature of a society that increasingly forgets that public figures are actual, breathing human beings with fundamental, non-negotiable rights to absolute bodily autonomy and basic personal respect? Think about the sheer, mind-bending irony of this massive, horrifying situation. This is a grown man who just spent a year and a half aggressively throwing grenades, carrying heavy artillery, and enduring the intense, bone-chilling cold of the deep winter mountains while strictly commanding platoons of soldiers in one of the most intense military environments on the planet. He survived the harsh, heavily disciplined reality of the military without a single scratch, heavily praised for his outstanding service and remarkable leadership, only to return to the supposedly safe, civilian world and be aggressively, physically assaulted by the very people who claim to love him the most. Number 1. J-Hope. The Sunshine Paradox, a mask shattered, the price of perfection. We have finally reached the absolute pinnacle of our terrifying, mind-bending countdown, arriving at the number 1 most unbelievable, profoundly heartbreaking, and deeply reflective controversy that completely shattered the very foundational myth of the entire K-pop industry. Enter Jung Hoseok, universally celebrated and globally adored as J-Hope, the unparalleled dance commander, the flawless stage director, and the literal, beaming embodiment of sunshine and unwavering positivity for the world's biggest boy band. For over a decade, he has flawlessly, seamlessly carried the immense, superhuman burden of being the group's eternal mood maker, flashing that million-dollar, heart-shaped smile through agonizing physical pain, grueling exhaustion, and unimaginable mental stress, single-handedly lifting the spirits of his 6 brothers and millions of fans across the globe. But what exactly happens when the brightest, most blinding sun in the entire universe finally decides it is time to publicly, unapologetically embrace the terrifying, freezing darkness? The massive, unprecedented global controversy erupted with the highly anticipated release of his raw, entirely unfiltered, and profoundly gritty solo documentary and musical projects, where he aggressively, deliberately shattered the pristine, candy-colored sunshine mask he had been heavily mandated to wear for his entire adult life. Instead of the bright, easily digestible pop anthems the deeply entitled public eagerly expected, J-Hope delivered a heavy, fiercely rebellious, and intensely dark masterpiece that deeply explored themes of suffocating burnout, intense anger, the paralyzing fear of failure, and the deep, agonizing emptiness that perfectly shadows unimaginable global success. He bravely showed the entire world the heavily bruised knees, the intense, bone-crushing physical toll of his legendary dance routines, the terrifying moments of utter creative despair, and the suffocating, highly toxic reality of being legally and culturally obligated to be perfectly happy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The immediate, violent reaction from the conservative mainstream media and a deeply disturbed fraction of the general public was absolutely staggering, instantly igniting a massive, highly destructive media firestorm that ruthlessly attacked his fundamental core identity. Click-hungry journalists and heavily biased news anchors violently recoiled in sheer, unadulterated horror, aggressively publishing thousands of deeply malicious, highly speculative articles viciously accusing him of losing his way, spiraling into a dark, highly dangerous artistic depression, and selfishly destroying the highly profitable, perfectly safe Hope brand that had generated billions of dollars for his parent company. It was a massive, highly coordinated, and intensely hypocritical public which Hunt meticulously designed to forcefully shove him back into the tiny, brightly lit, heavily suffocating corporate box they had built for him. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable psychological torture of bravely stepping onto the global stage, completely stripping away your emotional armor to finally share your most profound, vulnerable, and deeply authentic human truth, only to be instantly, brutally punished by a deeply cynical society that violently demands you remain a one-dimensional, permanently smiling caricature for their effortless consumption. Behind the heavily guarded, multi-million-dollar corporate doors, the sheer, paralyzing panic among the high-level executives was reportedly absolutely deafening. J-Hope was widely considered the safest, most reliably uncontroversial, highly marketable asset in their massive corporate portfolio, heavily securing endless luxury brand deals and family-friendly endorsements through his flawless, upbeat persona. So, when he deliberately chose to dive headfirst into the gritty, rebellious roots of underground hip-hop and aggressively confront the deeply toxic positivity of the idol industry, the stock market violently trembled, and highly paid PR teams frantically scrambled, allegedly begging him to soften his intense, highly critical message. But Hosiak, armed with an unyielding, unbreakable artistic integrity, fiercely refused to back down or apologize for simply being a complex, multifaceted human being who experiences pain, anger, and profound exhaustion just like the rest of us. This explosive, earth-shattering controversy completely ripped the polite, heavily manufactured mask off the terrifying reality of the South Korean entertainment machine, aggressively forcing millions of people to violently confront their own deep-seated complicity in the psychological imprisonment of their favorite idols. Why do we selfishly, ruthlessly demand that these young, incredibly vulnerable artists completely suppress their dark, deeply human emotions just to keep us comfortably entertained? Is the highly romanticized concept of giving hope to the fans secretly a deeply toxic, highly abusive psychological contract that violently strips the artist of their fundamental right to simply bleed and cry when they are completely, utterly broken inside? The sheer, unadulterated bravery it took for J-Hope to completely dismantle his own flawless, highly profitable public image just to violently reclaim his authentic humanity is fundamentally unprecedented in the entire history of modern pop culture. As the intense, highly toxic media circus aggressively raged on, fiercely debating whether his profound artistic evolution was a brilliant masterpiece or a catastrophic, career-ending mistake, the fiercely loyal, highly perceptive global army completely saw through the massive, heavily fabricated corporate manipulation. They didn't blindly demand the return of the superficial, plastic smile. They aggressively rallied behind his raw, deeply bleeding heart, pushing his dark, highly experimental projects to the absolute top of the global charts, and unequivocally proving that true. Genuine love means fiercely embracing an artist in their absolute darkest, most terrifying shadows, not just when they are blindingly reflecting the light. This massive, paradigm-shifting moment wasn't just a simple controversy. It was a monumental, highly inspiring revolution that completely redefined the absolute boundaries of what a global idol is legally and culturally allowed to be. It heavily proved that the absolute, most dangerous, highly terrifying thing an artist can do in a multi-billion-dollar industry built entirely on carefully manufactured illusions is simply to tell the absolute, unfiltered truth. As we finally close the heavy, deeply terrifying book on these 7 mind-bending, deeply unsettling controversies, you are aggressively forced to look at the glittering, highly glamorous world of global superstardom with entirely new, deeply haunted eyes. Who is truly, fundamentally pulling the strings in this massive, highly dangerous game of fame, money, and power? Is it the greedy, power-hungry corporate executives, the deeply malicious, clickbaiting media, the violently obsessive stalkers, or is it the incredibly brave, profoundly resilient artists themselves, who continuously, fiercely fight to reclaim their stolen humanity against completely impossible, terrifying odds? The flawless, perfectly manicured illusion has been permanently, irreparably shattered, and the raw, highly uncomfortable reality is now violently staring you right in the face. Are you brave enough to truly accept the heavy, deeply agonizing cost of the absolute, unprecedented global domination you so eagerly consume every single day?